I applaud the SIGER, Mr. Stuart Bowen, and his colleagues for their Herculean work and tremendous public service that they have done. They have produced over 250 audits and inspections and over 370 investigations. Many would consider this prodigious work product to be sufficient, but these professionals have taken the time to think critically about it all and write it all down and distill it into what we can do to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes the next time. There are hard lessons
over the last 3 years. I'm joined here at the table by my Deputy Inspector General, Ginger Cruz, and to my left are my Assistant Inspector Generals, Brian Flynn for inspections, Dave Warren for audits, and John Novak for investigations. And they remain available to answer questions as they may come up.
It may be appropriate at that time to come back for additional staff.
Well, the one area where we could use more resources, and that it's a joint investigative audit effort that we have kicked off. It's carrying out our forensic audit mandate.
Thank you. There's two things that SIGER has considered over the years, and one of them was the lack of conditionality that was placed on the $50 billion that we spent on reconstruction. And although it was discussed about 2 years ago, it was not really pursued. And so one of the areas that might be considered moving forward is this issue of conditionality, because that would allow the Iraqis then to have some vested interest in the outcome of the projects that we gave them. And in so many cases, when you're talking to Iraqi officials today, they'll say it's a free gift, and sometimes it isn't the right gift. It isn't something that we could use. Perhaps it was too technologically advanced for the staff to be able to run it, and they don't have the capacity. Maybe they can't get the parts, or they can't get the chemicals needed to run a particular water treatment plant. And so it becomes very difficult for them to sustain a lot of the programs that we unilaterally perhaps decided to build. So I think conditionality is something that really should be considered. The other thing is Congress has already started to move towards the matching funds concept. And the last National Defense Authorization Acts has begun to put in requirements for matching funds. There is some confusion right now as to what do they mean by matching. Does this mean that all of the money that Iraq puts towards infrastructure projects is considered its match, and then you put that against how much the United States is putting in? That could cause problems because it's not really holding people accountable. And one of the areas that people are afraid to get into is commingling of funds. Do we want to have projects where you say the Iraqis will put in this percentage, the United States will put in this percentage, and we'll both have a vested interest in the outcome? There's been a reluctance to look at that because it's a messy contracting process, but it's certainly something else that we would consider an appropriate area for exploration by the Commission.
Thank you, and it's something we...
The international community is also examining this issue, and one of the examples of how it could be approached is being undertaken by the British, who have a slightly different system than we do. But one of the things they're trying is something called conflict pools. And rather than appropriating money to the different departments, which ensures that each department pursues its mission and sometimes there is a clash, it puts the money for a conflict in one pool and requires that their equivalent of USAID, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense all agree on the priorities and how that money is going to be spent in a contingency operation. That was not something that happened here, and one of the biggest challenges we have today is while the NSPD put the State Department in charge, yet 85 to 90% of the money was under DoD purview. So you have a real challenge because of the organization. So one of the opportunities might be to look elsewhere at other examples. Not that they've proven that they can work absolutely, but it is certainly worth consideration.
Thank you. Just one final quick question.
Two things, actually, outcomes and strategic plans. It's a recurring theme in all of the audits that we do, and Dave Warren and Glenn Furbish and the team of our auditors are constantly saying that. A lack of a strategic plan that goes beyond this budget cycle, that goes beyond what we're trying to do today. And one of the things that we constantly had trouble with in Iraq was the orders were very short-sighted, and if you would have told the Iraq reconstruction officials back in 2003 that they had 5 years and $50 billion, a great likelihood would have been that they would have planned much better and been able to execute much more solid decisions in the course of that. But instead, it's waiting to see what budget you get and then reacting. In Afghanistan, the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction just put out his report last week, and one of his major findings is a lack of a strategic plan, a lack of an understanding of what is the intended outcome. And our great fear is, before we go pouring more money in, we really need to know, what are we trying to accomplish? How do we measure if we're accomplishing it or not? And at what point do you turn off the spigot so you're not pouring money into a black hole without really knowing what the outcome will be?
You know,
No, I'm not satisfied that we have a system now in place that will meet that mission. And that's why I raised the concern earlier that the risk makes the Civilian Reserve Corps discretionary. This
Rapidly as the troops draw down in Iraq, one of the key concerns is the cost of security. For the costs that we've cataloged to date have all been calculated on the fact that we've had roughly 150,000 troops. And when we talk about PSDs protecting the various officials that conduct reconstruction, they do so within a pocket of security provided by the military, and that is a cost that is not actually calculated. So when we say $6.5 billion was spent on private security, that's in addition to all of the sunk costs of all of these troops. So when we go out with PSDs, it's within a pocket of a striker group, or, you know, the Humvees with an entire group of military. As you take those military away in Iraq, if they continue to do certain levels of reconstruction, especially in the provinces, while they will depend a little bit on Iraqi army and Iraqi police, the question then becomes, how expensive is private security? And the real key is, as long as people know what the cost will be, and as long as they're willing to bear that cost, then that's a strategy that can be employed. But part of the problem is the true costs are not really known. And so one of our fears in 2008 and 2009 is we're going to reach a point where we're going to have to use private security, and the costs could escalate dramatically.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clark. Commissioner Zackheim?
yes, thanks. One, we've been talking about huge sums of money.
Additional point that we're finding in our investigations right now is the fact that if contracts were not written appropriately to begin with, which is a prescriptive recommendation, that it's very hard, if not impossible, to pursue that money again. If the contract said, go out and do work on this project, and it doesn't say what you expect from them. Part of the problem that we're having is when we go back with the contracting officers or go back to look for fraud and try to hold folks accountable, we can't, because the contract was written so loosely that the lawyers will say, well, they met the contract requirements. So that's another area that could be looked at to be tightened up.
Mm-hmm. I just want to thank you for your excellent work. You've done a terrific job, you and your office.
Mean in the setting of Afghanistan?
We looked at conditionality as an office when we were doing the quarterly reports, and one of the things that was not really put in place early on, and that in the last 2 years we have seen, is any sort of requirement for agreements by the receiving government to do something in exchange for the project that they're being given. And this is standard international development practice. One of the reasons why the United Nations and the World Bank were reluctant to pour a lot of money into Iraq in the beginning, because part of the point of pouring the money in is not to necessarily build the plant. It's the act of getting that money in there that gets the government engaged, that gets them engaged, lets them understand how to pursue future grants. It's the sustainability question, you know, giving someone fish versus giving them a fishing rod. And so the idea of conditionality was never applied in Iraq. I know it was considered a couple of times, but in the end we gave $50 billion without requiring anything. And so it could be something as simple as requiring the government of Iraq to sign a memorandum of agreement ensuring that they will provide doctors that will operate the $20 million hospital that we are providing for them in a certain province. And while those are things that are now being pursued on an ad hoc basis, if that was done as a condition of the contract, before we will build, you know, before we give you the $15 billion to develop your Iraqi army and your Iraqi police, You must make sure that the militias are removed from the police and that the types of screening or vetting for the police officers meet a certain requirement. So there's a lot of different ways to do that, both in soft projects and in hard projects, and it's just was never done in Iraq, and it's something that perhaps in Afghanistan would work.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both very much.